Iran's supreme leader calls protesters thugs as the government shuts down the internet. The state's official death toll stands at least 3 in unrest over fuel prices. Hong Kong police launch an operation to flush out protesters barricaded inside a university. Around 200 demonstrators are using petrol bombs and bows and arrows to resist. And Venice, Italy sinks deeper underwater with a third day of record tide levels just this week. The mayor says the flooding has the city on its knees. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. I'm Charlie James. Protests over a fuel price increase in Iran have now been reported in 100 cities and towns across the country. After days of unrest, the government cut internet access on Sunday, an effort to clamp down on the spread of images and organization. Iran's supreme leader has backed the decision to hike gasoline prices by 50% and is blaming the demonstrations on opponents and foreign enemies.
Some people would definitely get upset over this decision, but damaging and setting fire to property is not something normal people would do. It is only hooligans that would do that. All the centers of the world's wickedness against us have cheered for this unrest.
Anka Ula brings us more on this story, along with our correspondent on the ground.
Flames painted dark skies as protests flared deep into the night in dozens of cities across Iran, after the government raised fuel prices on Friday. 2 days later, Iran's supreme leader threw his support behind the move, classifying violent protesters as thugs.
Setting a bank on fire is not an act done by the people. This is what thugs do. Such illegal actions would not solve any problem, but add insecurity on top of other problems.
This bank in Tehran was one of many buildings burnt down by demonstrators. Elsewhere in the country, police fired tear gas, used water cannon and clubs to disperse protesters. But the actions were mostly peaceful. In the capital, many abandoned their cars on the road, paralyzing the city's main highways.
I can't afford petrol that is 30,000 riyals per liter. Blocking the roads is our stand against the price hike.
We don't know how to deal with this economic crisis. This price hike is too much for us to afford.
The government says higher fuel prices will fund subsidies for 60 million Iranians from lower-income households. But many say they're growing weary of the government's promises.
The government promised to stop inflation and give us more money. But now they've increased the petrol prices to pay for these benefits. It's going to be a disaster.
The situation could degenerate even further. Dozens were arrested in the central city of Yazd after clashing with police. Iran's interior minister warned protesters that any disruptive moves would be met with a strong police and judicial response.
Anti-government protesters in Iraq are gaining ground, inching closer to their goal of reaching Baghdad's heavily fortified Green Zone. Sunday, they took control of 3 bridges leading to the Green Zone, which is the seat of government and site of many embassies. On one bridge, a protester was killed during clashes with security forces after a tear gas canister hit them directly in the head. 2 rockets also struck around the Green Zone, but police sources say they caused no casualties or major damage. Since the protests began on October 1st, across the nation, at least 320 people have been killed and thousands more wounded. Voters in Algeria are set to go to the polls on December 12th to choose their next president. And presidential campaigning officially kicked off Sunday, with 5 candidates vying to replace the country's longtime leader. But not everyone is happy with the process. Thousands of citizens packed the streets of the capital of Algiers on Sunday to oppose the vote, claiming that the election would only serve to keep the elite in power.
One of these men will be the next president of Algeria. All are former ministers or supporters of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and whoever wins will have their legitimacy questioned. On the streets of Algeria, thousands came out to decry the election as a sham.
We want a civil state, not a military state. The government should all step down. No election. We deserve new faces, other than former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government.
The protests are entering their 40th week. They began because of widespread popular discontent with President Bouteflika's long rule. In April, he resigned, and his brother and a number of former ministers have since been jailed for corruption. But the protesters fear the candidates will carry on his policies regardless. For one candidate, it's an issue that cannot be ignored.
The people came out into a popular movement with great strength and courage to face themselves in the first place. That is why I commit myself to understanding these changes.
Demonstrators believe that the lack of public enthusiasm will lead to an historically low turnout. With 3 weeks before polling day, it will be up to politicians and their supporters to prove them wrong.
On Monday, Hong Kong police threatened for the first time that they may fire live bullets during demonstrations. This warning comes after pro-democracy protesters fired arrows and threw petrol bombs at officers on Sunday during a standoff at a university campus. Police have used live rounds during past protests, but only in a few isolated incidents. Our correspondent Oliver Ferry updated us earlier on Sunday's unrest.
Hong Kong was a city enraged on Sunday as police laid siege to the barricaded Polytechnic University. It was the last redoubt of 4 university occupations. After almost 24 hours of assault, the police gave protesters an ultimatum to leave the campus by 10 p.m. or else they would storm it. Throughout the day, the young protesters put up fierce resistance, repelling police with petrol bombs, bows and arrows and catapults, setting fire at one point to an armoured vehicle. The police surrounded the campus on all sides, keeping other protesters away, who gathered in their thousands in surrounding neighbourhoods. While all this was happening, the city's chief executive, Carrie Lam, was nowhere to be seen. Police said that they did not rule out using live rounds, leaving many in Hong Kong to fear the worst after a week of violence.
Thousands of Georgians protested outside the nation's parliament Sunday, demanding snap elections. This after lawmakers failed to pass a promised electoral reform measure. Demonstrators blocked the capital's main avenue, then set up tents to maintain an around-the-clock protest. After demonstrations this summer, the dominant Georgian Dream Party promised a constitutional amendment, which would allot legislature seats according to the percentage of votes received by each party. But it failed to pass this week after many Georgian Dream legislatures voted against the measure. And finally, on the program, weather woes continue in Venice, Italy. Sunday, the Renaissance city suffered a record 3rd flood in the same week, closing the iconic St. Mark's Square. The latest high water mark hit 150 centimeters just days after reaching the highest level in half a century. Nick Rushworth takes us there.
A wet weekend in Venice. The city gets 36 million visitors a year. For the ones there now, Sunday saw a 3rd exceptional high tide in less than a week. It is a disaster too for local businesses.
After Manchester scream, this is my scream. We work in Venice. We have been working for so many years in this city, but it's increasingly difficult.
The government has appointed the mayor of Venice as a special commissioner to deal with the crisis.
The most urgent thing is, of course, to bring relief to the population. Those who can't stay in their houses anymore will need to be relocated somewhere else. First of all, we need to bring safety. In the meantime, we need to restart activities in the city. As you may have seen, we have already fixed the boardwalks and the ferry landings.
High tides are forecast to reach a maximum of 110 centimeters in the coming days, giving the authorities the opportunity to assess the damage. The current cost estimate is around €1 billion, €20 million in emergency funds have been released to deal with immediate problems. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Italy, authorities in Florence and Pisa are monitoring the Arno River, whose water levels have risen rapidly due to heavy rain.
Stay tuned to France 24.